Hi everyone, my name's Ayush. I'm a course manager here at Udacity on the iOS team, and today we're holding a webcast to talk about, we're going to talk about navigation and how to create a custom transition in your iOS apps. So these two topics are really important, and we should clear them up right before we start making any serious progress in the iOS nano degree. So we've been noticing recently over a lot of projects ranging from Mimi to Virtual Taurus to even your Project 5 submissions that people aren't necessarily using transitions correctly. And that can be really problematic because it can cause giant memory issues in your app. It can cause just big problems that seriously need to be addressed right away. So we're going to do that first, and then we're going to walk through a custom example where we're going to create a custom transition which can add a lot of character to some of your apps and differentiate them from a lot of the other apps in the App Store. So without further ado, let's start with our presentation. So what we're going to do is we're going to start here at the storyboard, and we're going to walk through each of these different segues and try to figure out what they mean. So when you when you control click a button and you drag it to a new view controller, what that does is it prompts you to create a segue between the button and the next view controller. So when you press the button, that segue gets activated, and depending on what type it is, it'll present the new view controller. So there are a few important segues. They're all listed under the action segue category. So show detail, present modally, present as popover, and custom. Then we have a series of non-adaptive action segues. So these include push and modal, but they're depreciated in this version of iOS, so it's better just to not use them. And then another quick clarification, show detail and present as popover are usually just reserved for the iPad. So we'll just talk about show, present modally, and custom today. If at any point you have questions about this presentation, feel free to post them in the chat, and we'll look at them as soon as this presentation is over. So let's first talk about the show segue. Now, the show segue is usually used with a navigation controller. So a navigation controller consists of that navigation controller and then the root view controller. And this is where it kind of all starts. So to really understand the show segue, we need to first understand how the navigation controller works. So each navigation controller maintains a stack of view controllers. And when we use the show segue, we push a new view controller onto the stack, which slides the original away. You'll notice this a lot when you press a button in some of the iOS apps that you might be using, and a new view slides in from the right side, replacing the one on top. When we do that, it looks similar to this, where the second is on top of the first, and then if we add another one, the third is on top of the second. Something to really note is when we use show, there's also something called pop. And what pop allows us to do is remove items from the top of the stack. So when you're done using a particular view controller, for example, use pop to take it off the stack and show the earlier one. Like that. In that case, pop removed the third view controller from the navigation stack. You can do this in Storyboard, or you can also write this in code. And the code way to write the show would be navigation controller.push view controller. So this show segue belongs to that navigation controller, and pushing it adds it to the navigation controller stack. Similarly, if you want to pop a view controller, you can just do navigation controller.pop view controller, and that will remove it from the navigation stack. There are a lot of use cases for these navigation controllers and show segues, and let's look at a few of them. So master detail is one of the most common ones, and this is when you use a table or a collection view and you want to view more information about one of the items that are listed there. When you click on the table view cell, you're usually taken to a detail page where it tells you more information or lets you click on more links to view different topics about it. That's one case for a show. Another case would be to present related topics. For example, if you're on a login page and you press the sign up button, then you might want to use a show segue to tell the user, you might want to use a show segue because sign up is pretty related to login, and therefore you should be able to move back and forth between the two. Likewise, if you ever want a back button displayed in your app, and this is so very important, then you use a show segue, because that way it adds things on top of the navigation controller stack, and you can pop that whenever you want to go back. And there are a lot more use cases. Let's look at a few industry examples to really understand when to use this. So here's an example of the Instagram app here. So on the first image, we're just looking at a picture, and if we tap the name of the user, we're taken to the user's detail page. Now, notice that the user and the user detail page are related, and so it's pushed on top. Similarly, when we tap on another photo, that photo detail page is pushed on top. And if we click on the number of likes, the names of all the likers are pushed on top of that. So this is all in a navigation controller, and all of these different segues are the show type. Here's another example. This is Strava. So Strava is like a social activity app. What we're looking at here is a bike ride. So my bike ride, actually, just last week. When we click on the ride, it pushes the details about the ride on top of the navigation controller stack. And then if I click on the small icons which display who I was cycling with, it pushes that information on top of the stack as well. Similarly, if I press on another person's ride info, it'll push that on. So here's another example when you could use show. The App Store also prominently features show. These are screenshots from yesterday when America was going through Super Tuesday. So that's why there's a whole bunch of red, white, and blue on the App Store. Okay, so if we click on the banner, which says on the campaign trail, it pushes a new view controller, which contains all of the apps that are featured in the on the campaign trail section. Likewise, if we tap on a particular app, the information about that app is pushed onto the navigation controller. Similarly, if we click on the name of the company that makes NBC News, it'll display a list of all the apps that NBC News makes. So that's also pushed onto the stack. Okay, so that was the show segue. It's prominently used to add the back button or to display more information or just to show related topics. The next segue we need to talk about is present modally. Present modally is used in a fashion such as the one described below, when you want to go from one view controller to another view controller. And this doesn't necessarily need a navigation controller. So with present modally, what we're working with is a view hierarchy. So when we add a new view controller on top of the hierarchy, we cover up the old one. So the old one doesn't just slide away, it's actually hidden and a new one's put on top. And that kind of looks like this. So in this case, second would be the view controller that's showing, whereas first is kind of just hidden away underneath. Similar to the pop that we talked about earlier, we can use dismiss to remove the top view controller from the view hierarchy. So when we used dismiss earlier, it removed the second view controller. And just like with the navigation controller, we have a slightly different syntax to present and to dismiss a new view controller. So we can use the syntax that's described in the slide. Okay, and present modally also has its own use cases. Present modally isn't used as often, but it's used to present not entirely related topics. For example, if you're on the calendar app and you want to add a new event, well, that isn't necessarily related to the calendar directly, and for that you would use present modally segue. Similarly, forums. So if someone is browsing your app and to like a post, they need to have logged into the post or into the app. In that case, you would use a present modally segue to display a form for the user to sign in. That way, the user can either cancel the login or they can actually log in. Similarly, we'll look at a few apps that kind of use these present modally segue. So Instagram's a really popular example. If we press on the capture button, then we're prompted, or it's the photo image taking view controller is presented modally. All right, back to Strava. If we push the plus button on the top left corner of the screen, we're presented an add activity view controller, and that's presented modally. So in that case, you can either cancel the activity and just not add anything, or you can save the activity that you've added. You can also edit your profile. Similar to the add activity, you can either cancel the form submission or you can save it. So that way the user can't just back out and then you'd be like, should I auto-save the information, or should I just discard all the information the user typed in? This way the user knows exactly what's happening. And then also for websites. So if you try to view the help category for an app, for example, it presents the website modally, and that way once the user's done, they can just press the done button and get back to what they were browsing. We also have the App Store here. If you click on the wish list icon on the top right corner, you're going to be presented modally with a wish list. That way, once you're done browsing the wish list, you can just go on to whatever else you were doing in the app. And then the featured, which acts as a filter, is also really important because you can either select all the filters or just press cancel to go back to the screen that you were previously on. And then lastly, we talked about login earlier. Here's an example of the login on the Udacity app. If you just open the Udacity app without having created an account, and you click on the top left corner, which displays your courses, it will automatically display a login view controller. Because you don't want to be able to see your courses without having logged in, and here it wouldn't make sense to push the login view controller, to show the login view controller with the navigation controller, but instead present it modally so users either have the option to cancel that screen or actually sign in. Alright, so now let's look at a few frequent problems that we've seen a lot of students having. One of the problems here is, so we start out at the following view hierarchy on the left. When Mimi first launches and the user doesn't have a meme already existing, we want the user to be automatically presented with an add meme view controller. And that way they can add a meme so it's displayed in their list. But what happens is sometimes students will present modally the memes view controller on top of that. So it looks like the view hierarchy on the right. What that does is you have a memes view controller, and then you push the add meme view controller, and then you push another view controller on top. Present modally another view controller on top. And that's a no-no. So here we have two instances of the same view controller. We don't want that. What happens is that just keeps on happening. So if you try to add another meme, we'll present modally another controller, and we'll present modally another controller. And that can cause big memory issues in your app. Instead, what we should do is we should call a dismiss call on the add meme view controller. So once you're done adding the meme, it just dismisses that view controller, and it goes back to the one underneath. That's what we should do. All right, so it's really important to dismiss view controllers once you're done using them, instead of constantly pushing new or present modeling new view controllers on top. All right, let's look at another common problem, and that is with navigation controller placement. So here we're just outlining a rough storyboard. So in this storyboard, we have a navigation controller, which is attached to a tab bar controller. And in the tab bar controller, we have a collection view on the first page and a table view on the second page. And when we click on one of the items in the collection or table view, we are shown the details of that view. Let's look at an image to see what this actually looks like. Okay, so on the left is a navigation controller stack. We start with a tab bar controller. And so when you click on this, look, it's a meme, little cell. It opens up the meme detail. So this is pushed onto the navigation controller stack. And look at what happens. If we have the tab bar controller as one of the view controllers, essentially, of the navigation controller, meme detail will replace the entire tab bar controller. So you won't see the tab bar controller on the bottom. That's an important thing to note. Let's look at how that is used here. So in Strava, when we click on one of these cells, notice the tab bar on the bottom goes away. That's because the entire tab bar is pushed away and replaced with the ride detail view controller. Okay, now let's look at a slightly different layout. So here, instead of starting with a navigation controller, we start with a tab bar controller. Okay, and so each of the views in the tab bar has its own navigation controller. And this is laid out the same way, but instead when we click on the collection view cell or the table view cell, we're going to see the difference it creates. Okay, so now our navigation controller has a sent memes page, which you can see on the first screenshot. And then when you click on the sent meme, it shows a meme detail page. Notice that the tab bar at the bottom is there. Okay, that's really important to note. So instead of replacing the entire tab bar controller, we're just replacing the sent memes view controller that's within the tab bar. Okay, let's look at an example of that. Notice in Instagram, all of the buttons at the bottom are still there when you click on one of the new items. That's something really important to note. There's not one best practice, but it depends on what you're trying to do with your app. Okay, and lastly, let's just address a common question. One of the questions is, what is the point of this window variable inside of the app delegate? Now, every app has a window, and what the window does is it displays all of the app's contents. It handles all of the touch events, so when you click on buttons or you add a gesture recognizer, that's all handled by the window, and then it's bubbled down to all of the view controllers that are there. It also handles orientation changes. So have you ever noticed when you turn your phone to the left on an app that supports this, that all of the views will kind of shift with it? That's all handled by the window, and then it's sent all the way down to the view controllers for them to kind of deal with. So let's look at the window on the left. The window is kind of the base layer for all of the app, and then all of the new views that are controlled by either the navigation controller or the tab bar controller, they're displayed on top of this window. Now, if you had cells, the cells would be displayed on top of the UI views and things like that. So I hope that made sense. Now let's look at a few questions you might have. All right. Let me just open up the comments page. All right. So Michael asks, present modally. With regards to the Instagram example, would we use present modally when opening the camera section of the app? Yes. I think I answered that, and I guess you know the answer as well now. Are there any other questions? I'd love to address them now. So a lot of this navigation is really about practice. As you start to do more of the navigation and you start to work with larger and larger apps, you'll realize that it's actually really important to pop view controllers and dismiss view controllers. So that's just something you'll get the swing of as you do it, yeah. So now we have another question. What are the differences with dealing iPad? So I said we wouldn't talk about the other segues, but let's look at them here. So the other segues are show detail and present as popover. Now, if you guys have an iPad, you can see show detail in apps like the Mail app. So when you click on a particular email you might be receiving, what it does is it replaces the view on the right side, and that's called the detail view of the split view controller. These are all terms that I'm throwing out. You can do some more research on them, but essentially it replaces the content to the right with the information that you want. Present as popover is used on the iPad primarily to display small settings or things like that. Again, you should be able to see this on a variety of apps, but it will display a small box, essentially, which contains other information that might be necessary to playing with the app. And that way you can avoid displaying an entire new screen. Instead, just use the larger screen estate of the iPad to display small bits of information. All right. Okay. So if we don't have any other questions, what we can do is move on to our custom transition demo. So the description of this live stream should contain starter templates and the finished code for the app that we're going to work with. Now this is a small weather app. It just displays weather for a few different cities that I've already fed in. Um, let's look at it here. So we're going to start here with a few things. What we should do is we should first see what our finished app is supposed to look like. Okay, so this is the starting page. When you click on a city, it does a cool little transition to display the new view controller. And similarly, when you go back, it does the reverse of that transition. So let's just take a quick look at what actually happens. Notice that this screen will kind of decrease in size, and then the screen to the right, the screen that's being pushed on, will replace it. Okay, it's just really quick, and it adds a little bit more character than a normal push transition would. So let's walk through it. What we're going to start by doing is creating a new class to handle our animation for us. Now, I have small snippets of code that I've already added. We're just going to drag them in and see what they do. So one of the things you have to take note of is that this class has to be a subclass of, this has to use the NSObject protocol. Okay. To create our custom transition, we have to make sure that city animation adheres to this UI view controller animated transitioning protocol. That's just one of the requirements for creating custom transitions. The next thing we want to do is, notice we had a few different cases, right? So when we present it, we want a different transition than when we reverse it, okay? So to control how that works, and just using one animation, we're just going to create a simple enum to declare what type of transition is currently happening. Okay, so right now it starts out at presenting, and then we can also control some of the features of our transition using the scale factor variable. And that controls essentially how small the first screen gets when we transition over. Lastly, these are two methods that we are required to declare with this UI view controller animated transitioning protocol. The first one is where all of the good stuff for the transition happens. So where the transition happens. And then this one is just for duration, okay? So transition duration. Our transition is really short, so we're just going to return 0.4 seconds, and that's how long our entire transition will last. Next, one of the things to realize when we're creating these custom transitions is they use something called a container view. And this is essentially like a scratch pad for all of our changes to take place on. And then when we're finally done, we call complete transition to inform everything else that, yes, this transition is complete and we can kind of move back to what we were originally doing. Okay, so what this does is if we don't have that container view, which isn't very likely to happen, we're just going to exit out and not worry about the transition at all. All right, so let's start setting this transition up. One of the things we need for our custom transition is we need to know what the view controller, or what the view looks like that we're starting from, and the view that what the view looks like that we're going to. So, for example, this, when we're pressing on San Francisco, this would be our from view. This entire view controller, or the view on the view controller, and then when we press, when we start the transition, this is our to view because this is the view we're going to. Likewise, when we're going backwards, when we're starting at this screen and we press the back button, this is our from view, and when we end up with, that's our to view. Okay, that lets us add it to our container view scratch pad and kind of configure what's going on the screen. We're going to move back here to transition mode. So when we're presenting the detail view, we're going to use a slightly different version of our transition than when we're popping it. Okay, so I've dragged in a big chunk of code here, but essentially what's important to understand here is this code will add the view that we're going to. So this code will add this detail view for the weather directly to the right of the screen. So this won't be originally displayed on the screen when it starts, but it's going to be added just outside the screen's radius, or width. Then we're also going to add the view that we start out with, and this is just going to be added at the very beginning of the screen, and we're going to make sure that our to view is on top. So that way when we do the transition, it's not hidden underneath our shrinking screen, but rather put on top of it. Okay, so what this UI view.animate with duration code does is it changes the size of the front view. Basically, it shrinks it into the middle, and it slides the to view over. Okay, with this syntax, we can say that, yes, once this animation has completed, we're just going to say that our entire transition is over and move on with it. Okay, now let's just quickly look at the reverse. When we start from the other side, we're going to first add our view that we're going to on the screen. So this view appears right when the view that we start out from is just disappearing. For example, when we press the back button, we want the view to appear from underneath the view controller that we're starting out at. So that's why we need to add this view in. Okay. Similarly, we're going to start out with our go-to view already scaled down, and that's where we kind of left it off up here. So we're going to start over there, and then we're going to add our current view on. Okay. And this is going to be on top, so when we slide it off, the new view appears from underneath it. Okay. So next, we're just going to call our animate with duration code again. This time, we're going to slide the view off the screen instead of pushing it on. And then we're going to make sure that that the view that we're going to expands to fit the entire screen. Lastly, we're just going to complete the transition to make sure everything's over. Okay, so that's all we need to worry about for the transition. In case of these present and pop cases, what you can do is actually change them to whatever animation you could dream of. A lot of times apps will have something like a bubble transition. So essentially a view expands in a giant circle to hide or to show the view underneath it. Those animations can be really cool. We're not going to talk about those today. This is solely to give you just a rough example of what you might have to do to create one yourself. All right, so the next view we have to look at is our city selector view controller. So we're performing a segue here when we click on one of the collection view cells. So those are just the icons for San Francisco or Los Angeles to view the weather. So when we click at those, we're performing a segue, and we can change the animation that segue uses by adding this function calling, or this method. This method is a delegate of the UI navigation controller delegate protocol. And what it does is it tells the navigation controller that this is the transition to use to handle this this particular transition. Okay, so what we're going to do is create an instance of our animation transition. If our from view controller is a city selector, so if we're starting out right here, then the animation modes or the transition mode is going to be present, right? Because we want to show the next view controller. Otherwise, if we're starting out at the weather detail view controller, it's going to be pop, so we can go backwards. All right, and then just one last final thing. And because this adheres to the UI navigation controller delegate class, what we're going to do is make sure that our navigation controller uses that delegate. So we're just going to set it to self. Okay. Now let's just run it and see what happens. All right, so it should replace that weather. Cool. We press on New York, and bam, our transition works. So that's how you create just a simple push custom transition in an iOS app. These are really useful, and you can do a lot of really cool things with them. This is just a very quick demo of some of the functionality of it. So you can find this finished code in the description of this live stream below. All right, let's go back to some questions. All right, so it seems that there aren't any questions tonight. Um, Again, this is a great topic to just understand. Navigation is really important to understand in iOS apps. And while it may seem simple, and it is simple, you just need to make sure that when you add stuff, you also want to make sure you remove stuff. And that way you won't create giant memory issues, and you can really control the layout or the fluidity of apps. Um, so Liang Tang asked, there is a lot of code. Where can we download the code? It should be in the description of this live stream. Okay, there's another question. Are there built-in custom transitions or libraries we could use to handle common transitions? So there are a lot of transitions already provided by Apple. For example, when you push something and the screen slides from the right to the left, that's a transition that's built in to the show segue. Similarly, for present modal, there are a few transitions that slide the view controller from the bottom of the screen to the top. There are also some that kind of fade in a new view controller on top. So you can play around with those in Storyboard. There are a whole bunch of transitions built in, and then if you look on GitHub for just custom transitions, you should be able to find several other libraries which kind of have them as well. That's a great place to kind of go for reference. And then Michael asks, sorry, how did you get custom code in the project? So if you're talking about the snippets here on the right, on the bottom right of the screen, these are actually really cool. I just learned about them earlier today, actually. So what you can do is you can select a piece of code that you might use frequently. So for example, I want to say that, yes, I use this layout a lot. So what you can do is you can just highlight this and drag this to the bottom right. And if you scroll to the bottom, it's going to create a code snippet. Okay. Now code snippets are really useful because then you can just drag them back on, and it's just going to keep copying and pasting that code every single time you want them. All right. Great. So if there aren't any other questions for tonight, feel free to post any other questions you might have in our forums, or the student Slack channel is a great place as well. You can also schedule appointments with myself and a few other course managers here at Udacity and learn more. Okay, just a final question for tonight. Evan, in your experience, is it better to use a split view controller for supporting both iPad and iPhone form factors in a complex application, or build two separate storyboards tailored to each individually? That is a great question. So the way storyboards started out is we actually started out having both an iPhone and an iPad storyboard. And that was really great and all, but with auto layout and size classes, it switched to just using one storyboard. I would say it would be better to use a split view controller, and that might take a little bit of a learning curve, but that way you also support the iPhone 6S, the 6S Plus and the 6 Plus, where there's a slightly different layout when you rotate it to landscape. So definitely try using the split view controller. It might be a little steep of a learning curve in the beginning, but it's a great tool, and you should definitely know how to use it. It's not something that we have a course on, but in your own time, when you're working on another app in the future, it could be kind of fun to look at. Yeah. So thanks everyone for coming out tonight. Have a great night. And again, any questions, please schedule an appointment with us or post it in the forums or Slack channels. All right. Good night, everyone.